We don't think turning Medicare over to a board of 15 unelected bureaucrats to cut it in ways that will surely lead to denied care for current seniors is a benefit. That's why I want to yield 2 minutes. Well, that's not why, but I also want to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Indiana, a former member of the Budget Committee, Mr. Stutzman.
Notwithstanding, the gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I rise in strong support today of the balanced budget put forward by my friend and Chairman Paul Ryan, and the reasonable and practical approach that this Budget Committee has taken while they budget hardworking taxpayer dollars. Mr. Speaker, this budget debate goes deeper than spreadsheets and focuses on the longevity of the American dream. Today we are considering a Republican budget that actually balances in 10 years, calls for pro-growth, pro-job tax reform, and strengthens Medicare for our seniors and future generations. While in the Senate, Harry Reid and Patty Murray are considering a budget that never balances. It increases taxes by $1 trillion and lets Medicare and Social Security race towards bankruptcy. And it turns Medicare into a program that rations benefits to seniors. Make no mistake, Washington is approaching $17 trillion of debt, and more than 12 million Americans are unable to find work. The decisions we make will either sink us deeper into debt or put us on a path that encourages job creation and restores the belief that if we work hard and make tough choices, our kids will inherit a stronger country. Mr. Speaker, the choice is clear. If Hoosier families balance their budgets, Washington doesn't have an excuse. It's time the President and the Senate offer real solutions for hardworking Hoosier families. I commend Chairman Ryan and the House Budget Committee for their hard work, and I urge my colleagues to support the resolution. I yield back.
The time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I now yield 2 minutes to another terrific new member of the Budget Committee, the gentlelady from New Mexico, Ms. Grisham, Lujan Grisham.
The gentlelady from New Mexico is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to the Republican budget plan. This misguided and cruel plan abandons the economic recovery. It is a path to greater disparity, and it protects the affluent while further squeezing the middle class. We cannot afford this Republican budget. According to the Economic Policy Institute, it will cost us 2 million jobs in 2014. Now, this is on top of the 750,000 jobs we will lose this year due to sequestration. The Republican budget attacks the various industries where the largest job growth should be occurring. We need to invest in critical infrastructure like the healthcare system as a key way to create jobs here at home and protect our most vulnerable. According to a 2012 Bureau of Labor Statistics study, the health sector is going to be the leader in job growth throughout the rest of this decade. Unfortunately, the path once again chosen by Republicans in this Congress will put job growth in jeopardy. The Center on Budget and Policy Priorities estimates that the budget plan under consideration cuts $2.5 trillion from health care by 2023. How? It turns Medicare into a voucher program, and it block grants Medicaid to states. Now, this will force health care providers to cut jobs and to reduce services to their patients. With an aging population that will require greater care, we should be investing in critical infrastructure like health care and other programs like disease and care management, which have and will continue to reduce spending in Medicare. So let's be clear. This budget wreaks havoc on healthcare systems in this country. It hurts patients, and it devastates future job growth in the health sector. Lastly, this plan also chooses to arbitrarily balance the budget in 10 years, which is harmful to the fragile economy and middle-class families. The notion that 10 years is the magic number to balance the budget is ludicrous. It is similar to telling mortgage holders who are responsibly paying their mortgage that instead of having 30 years to pay it off, now they have 10. Would they be able to? Many of them would end up losing the house, and that is exactly what the Ryan budget does and why, to the nation's budget and to our economy, it puts us underwater. Instead, I would encourage all of my colleagues to support the Van Hollen substitute, which is a balanced approach that leads to job creation and is the right way forward. I yield back.
Time of the gentlelady has expired. The gentleman from Wisconsin.
I yield 4 minutes to the gentleman from California, a member of the Budget Committee and also some other committee. The Appropriations Committee, Mr. Kelbert from California.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Mr. Ryan. This is what principled, visionary, responsible leadership looks like. I commend Chairman Ryan and the entire team for this budget and for insisting on regular order. I also congratulate this body for finally forcing the Senate to do something, introduce a budget. We owe it to our fellow Americans to be honest about the complex fiscal challenges and options before us. That's why today's debate is one of the most important we'll have this year. Nearly every day I hear from my hardworking constituents from the southwestern Riverside County struggling tremendously over the last 5 years. Despite the challenges they face, they continue to make ends meet by making tough fiscal decisions, whether it's for themselves, their families, or for their businesses. Most Americans don't understand why our elected officials can't do the same. Instead, they see us jumping from one crisis to the next, putting their lives and their well-being on a constant roller coaster. Frankly, I don't understand it either. You can't hide from the statistics. You don't have to be on the Budget Committee to understand our fiscal situation. A balanced budget is not a radical idea. It's a responsible one that the citizens of Riverside County and those around this country practice themselves. Economists across the spectrum agree that our current path is leading us to a debt crisis should we fail to act. Make no mistake, we're on the warning track, and we should reverse course before we slam into the wall. All Americans should have real concern about what this means for the future prosperity of their own families and of our own nation. Under the Obama administration, U.S. public debt as a percentage of GDP is over 70% and growing. We've seen European nations, there appears to be a tipping point on the debt-to-GDP ratio. And our current rate, we're nearing dangerous territory. The reserve currency status of the dollar and our rank among world economies will only carry us for so long. So what effect does this level of debt have on the economy and its citizens when things go south? All you have to do is look around like countries like Cyprus, Spain, Greece. In the case of Greece, you see a depressed environment where the unemployment rate is over 26%, severe austerity cuts and overhauls of gutted worker benefits, safety net programs, harming seniors and the country's poorest populace. Taxes on families and businesses have increased at a sharp rate, and divisive and violent social unrest has become commonplace. Most recently, we've seen a proposal to bail out Cyprus banks that could raid the savings account of its own population. These are the realities of a debt-ridden country. These are the realities of liberal policies that tax too much, spend too much, borrow too much, and produce far too few jobs. We cannot afford the path that we're on. Thankfully, we have time to change. America's course in the House Republican budget provides a 10-year plan. It puts the brakes on our non-sustainable spending levels, lays out a thoughtful program, reforms to ensure essential government services are solvent for generations to come, prioritizes a comprehensive restructuring of our tax code to simplify the system, and improves our fiscal condition in a way that will allow our economy to grow, providing opportunity for that work and work hard no matter what their station in life they start at. Fortunately, after being prodded along, the Senate is joining the House in this conversation after a 4-year absence. I don't favor their approach to the task before us, a plan that never balances with a failed stimulus spending and additional tax hikes. I suspect the President's budget will be similar once we finally receive it. However, we welcome the proposals because we'll have clear options laid before the American people and have a comprehensive and honest discussion about future choices. Vice President famously said, "Show me your budget and I'll show you what you value." Well, with the budget submitted, we're all forced to conclude that the White House values delay and obfuscation. And given this nonfeasance, as an optimist, I know that this process will allow us to find common ground. Addressing issues on this magnitude is never easy or pretty, but it is a process worth taking. House Republicans continue to stand ready to work with the President and our Democratic colleagues in the Congress to meet the complex challenges before us so we can get our nation back to a path of prosperity. Thankfully, the House Republican budget does exactly that. And with that, I urge a yes vote on House Res 25.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield a minute and a half to the gentleman from Vermont who's been very focused on these budget issues, Mr. Welch.
The gentleman from Vermont is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
I thank the gentleman and I thank Mr. Ryan. The focus and goal of this budget, as I understand it, is to eliminate the debt. That's a worthy goal. In fact, we all share it. But this budget, in my view, lacks ambition for other challenges. What about stagnant wages, middle class declining, lack of jobs? These are all fundamental issues that face the American economy. The middle class is shrinking. Wages now are what they were as a level of our economy as they were in 1966. Just a week ago when we voted for the sequester, it was a day when American profits were at a record, higher than they'd been since the 1950s, but American wages were back at 1966 levels. There is an assertion here that we lack credibility and that we're taxers and spenders. I reject that, but let me remind the folks on the other side that a lot of the policies that got us to this debt, a war in Iraq on the credit card, Afghanistan on the credit card, 2 tax cuts for the wealthy, promising benefits to everybody else, never paid for, Medicare Part D on the credit card. Then we had the collapse of the economy. Those were not our policies. Those were the policies of a previous president who erased a record surplus. And, may I have 30 seconds? And
time has not yet expired. I'll allow you, but if you want to give him 30 seconds now, we'll add it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield the gentleman another 30 seconds.
The gentleman is recognized for additional 30 seconds.
So there's a credibility question, but there's also an economic policy question. There's 2 assumptions in this budget. One is that austerity will lead to prosperity, that getting the debt down by any means possible, any cuts possible, will get us to the promised land. It's the pot of gold at the end of the Tea Party rainbow. No evidence for that whatsoever. The second is a faith-based conviction that if you give tax cuts to wealthy people, that will trickle down to the rest of us. No experience in showing that that can be successful. We should be cleaning up the tax code. We should be fighting waste, fraud, and abuse, whether it's in the Pentagon or in the health care system. We should be doing that together. This budget does not give us that chance. I yield back.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Wisconsin.
I yield myself just 30 seconds to say that austerity is what we're trying to prevent from happening. That's the irony of this debate. Austerity is what happens after the debt crisis hits. Austerity is what is happening in Europe. Austerity is cranking up taxes, slowing down your economy, cutting benefits on senior citizens after they've retired. That's what austerity is. That's what they call it. We're preventing that. We're preempting that. The goal of this budget, it's a reasonable plan to balance the budget, to grow the economy, to create more take-home pay so families can prosper. With that, I'd like to yield 3 minutes to a new member of the Budget Committee, the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Rice.
The gentleman from South Carolina is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Honored to serve on the House Budget Committee. Honored to advocate on behalf of this budget. There's one thing for sure. We can't keep going the way we are. If you look around the world, you look at countries like Cyprus, Spain, Portugal, Greece, and you see the consequence of unrestrained spending. The Republican plan balances in 10 years. The plan offered by the Senate never balances. And when we say balance, we mean matching revenue to spending, not spending more than you take in. When our colleagues across the aisle talk about balance, they use it as a code word for a tax increase. The Republican plan offers protections across the spectrum of American life. It offers our seniors the protection of making our promises good in Social Security and Medicare. No one will deny. OMB will tell you, the CBO will tell you, Medicare, the Medicare Trust Fund is going broke. It will expire in 11 short years. And the longer we wait to deal with that, the worse the problem becomes. It protects our middle class through tax reform and through repealing the Obamacare law. with its onerous regulations and taxes. It will structure our system for economic growth. We will stop hemorrhaging American jobs overseas, and we will bring American jobs back to these shores. It's one thing if we lose jobs because of low wages overseas. We don't ever want to compete in that arena. It's another if we lose jobs because our government is inefficient, bloated, and expensive. And finally, it protects our most vulnerable. It protects our young people. You know, I agree with then Senator Obama when he said it was immoral to continue to incur these massive debts. Of course, when he said it, since he said it, our debt is multiples of what he was decrying at that time. We are piling mountains and mountains of debt on our children and our grandchildren to fuel our addiction to spending. And it's got to stop, and it's got to stop now. I'm proud to stand for this Republican budget, and I urge its passage. I give back the rest of my time.
The gentleman yields back his time. The gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Under our budget proposal, the deficit is dropping rapidly, but we also address the jobs deficit so that we make sure more people get back to work. And with respect to the Medicare Trust Fund, I would just point out the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, extended the life of the Hospital Trust Fund by 8 years, and if Republicans did what they said they want to do, which was to repeal it, they would shorten the life of the trust fund to 2016, but even though they don't want to tell us, they apparently have kept that in. I now want to yield a minute and a half. I want to yield a minute and a half to the gentleman from Connecticut who has worked so hard to make sure that college is affordable to students in this country, Mr. Courtney.
Thank you, the gentleman from Connecticut is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as we talk about issue of young people in debt, one thing is very clear for 7.5 million young Americans who receive subsidized Stafford student loans, that in 103 days, the interest rate on those subsidized student loans is going to double from 3.4% to 6.8%. We have before us now two budgets, and one budget, the Democratic budget brought out by Mr. Van Hollen, protects the lower rate. The other budget by the majority party allows that rate to double to 6.8%. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York came out with a study just a few days ago which shows that, in fact, the student loan debt for young Americans has tripled over the last 8 years. We have one budget which protects Pell Grants, which reduces the need to borrow money to pay for college, and we have the other budget from the majority party which freezes Pell Grants at $5,665 a year. Any parent like myself who has kids in college, any student who is in college who believes that over the next 10 years that tuition is going to stay flat, obviously does not look at, has no understanding of what the trends are and have been over the last 20 years in terms of state withdrawal for higher education support and what's actually happening out there in the real world. We have one budget which speaks to the monumental challenge that young people who are trying to improve themselves and get ready for the workplace of the future. We have another budget which is blind to those challenges and which will reduce college to a system of haves and have-nots. We must invest in young people in the future. The Democratic budget, which protects the lower interest rate in the subsidized Stafford student loan program, understands that. The majority budget, which allows those rates to skyrocket, which freezes Pell Grants so that young families from poorer backgrounds will not be able to afford the cost of college, again, leaves this country basically behind in the competition for high-value jobs, for jobs that require skills, whether it's in science, technology, engineering, and math, or other areas of curriculum. The fact of the matter is, for young people, there is only one budget which speaks to them and addresses their needs. That's the Democratic budget that is brought out by Mr. Van Hollen. I yield back the balance of my time.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Wisconsin.
Yield myself 30 seconds to say the interest rate cliff in student loans was put into law by the Democrats in the first place. If we bring legislation to the floor that is paid for to deal with it, like we did last year, I would assume we had every reason to believe that we'll pass it. With that, I'd like to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Wisconsin, a new member of the Budget Committee, Mr. Duffy.
Gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm happy to hear my friends across the aisle talk about investing in our future and investing in our economy. But when they talk about that, I think we have to be clear that that's code for borrowing and spending more money. And we should truly talk about the cost of this debt. We all know today that we owe $17 trillion in debt. And if the Federal Reserve stopped printing money, the actual cost to service this debt, to pay the interest payments, would be about $500 billion, $500 billion. You go out 10 years, and our debt is going to be $25 trillion. And minimally, to service our interest payments on that debt 10 years from now, it's going to cost us $750 billion a year, or $7.5 trillion over 10 years. And so you talk about the cost of interest payments every year to service the debt, that's $750 billion that isn't going into education, it's not going into health care, it's not going into roads or schools or helping our poor. It's $750 billion that goes to interest payments. And so when you talk about investing in our future, we're not doing that. We're mortgaging our children's future. But let's be clear. There is someone who is investing in their future. It's the Chinese. They're investing in their future, buying American debt. And so when my little girls, my little 2-year-old Mariví and my 4-year-old Paloma, when they get to be our age, they're going to have this weight of interest and debt around their neck, and they're going to pay those payments back to those Chinese preschoolers. This is not responsible. And to hear my colleagues across the aisle stand up and talk about a balanced approach that continues this course of massive red, this is what our children inherit, and say this is what we want to give to them? Listen, if you ask moms around America, is this what you want for your children? Is this what you want them to inherit? Is this how you want them to invest their tax dollars? They would resoundingly stand up and say, heck no, be responsible, pay off the debt. We don't want them to have their massive tax dollars go to interest payments. Now, my friends across the aisle, they talk again about borrowing and spending and investing in our economy. And when they use that language, it sounds eerily familiar to the same language they used 4 years ago. This is the same argument that was used to borrow $1 trillion to help us grow our economy, create massive new jobs. The bottom line is that $1 trillion stimulus failed. We want a responsible approach, balance the budget, grow our economy, put our hard-working middle-class families back to work. The Republican budget actually does that. I would ask all my colleagues to actually support the Republican budget. I yield back.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Maryland.
Mr. Chairman, let me just respond to a couple things that were just said. The first is that when President Obama was sworn, in fact, before he even put his hand on the Bible, a little more than 4 years ago, we were losing over 700,000 jobs every month. The economy was actually spiraling downward at a faster rate than it was the time of the Great Depression. And thanks to the resilience of the American people and the emergency actions taken by the President and others, we stopped the free fall, we turned the corner, and there have been 36 consecutive months of private sector job growth, more than 6.4 million jobs created. We didn't get any help from our Republican colleagues when we had to take difficult decisions to prevent the total collapse of the economy. Now we've seen some momentum in the job market, and we have a Republican budget that's going to put the brakes on that growth. That, according to the Congressional Budget Office, and by the way, their budget includes the assumption of those continued sequestration levels into the next year. So let's talk about China for a minute. I got a letter the other day from the CEO of a major biotech company. Here's what he said. He said, over the last couple of years, because of the reduction in our national investment in science and research, he laid off 1,000 people. And because of the continuing sequester, they've imposed a hiring freeze right now. Those are jobs that now will not be created that would otherwise if we hadn't had the Republican approach to the sequester. And you know the real kicker? I hear Mr. Duffy talking about China. They're hiring people in China, not because of lower Chinese wages, but because China has decided to make a robust science and health care funding a national priority. In other words, the Chinese are copying the secrets to our success, things that helped our economy grow, things that are slashed in the Republican budget. And I say slashed? Yeah, because they cut that portion of the budget by more than 2 times the sequester. That's a fact. So if we're talking about competing with the Chinese or the Indians or the Europeans or anybody else who's out there, one of our global competitors, let's not allow them to borrow the secrets of our success while we're ignoring them here at home. And now I yield 2 minutes to a terrific new member of the Budget Committee, someone who's been focused in leading a lot of our anti-poverty efforts, Ms. Lee of California.
The gentlelady from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me thank our ranking member for your tremendous leadership and for yielding, and also to Chairman Ryan for a very spirited markup. I rise in strong opposition to the budget, to the Ryan budget. And let me just say, as a new member of the Budget Committee, I've had the opportunity now to really get into the weeds of the budget, which really is full of choices. But those choices would undermine our nation's future for the continued benefit of special interests and the wealthy. Bottom line, that's what this budget does. It would dismantle government, it would increase inequality, and leave the most vulnerable people on their own. We should reject this warped vision of America, and we should call this budget for what it is. Republicans call it a path to prosperity, but it really is a path to poverty for the middle class, for working families, for children, and for our seniors. The fact of the matter is, you cannot pretend to fight poverty while you make brutal cuts to the very programs that lift millions of Americans out of poverty. The Republican budget would make devastating cuts that will increase child hunger, cut off millions of seniors from access to health care, and throw struggling families off of TANF during the middle of a job crisis. The Republican budget proposes yet another $6 trillion tax cut for the 1%, the top 1% in our country, while focusing 66% of their cuts on shredding our nation's critical safety net for our children, our seniors, our disabled, and the poor. This budget would also cost 2 million jobs and slash nutrition and food assistance programs for 8 to 9 million people. Mr. Chairman, block granting Medicaid, turning Medicare into a voucher program, and gutting food assistance to our children and our seniors will not reduce poverty. It will make it much, much worse. Our Democratic budget will close special interest tax loopholes to raise the critical revenues that we need to invest in the American people. May I have another 30 seconds, Mr. Van Hollen?
I yield the gentlelady another 30 seconds.
Gentlelady is recognized for 30 seconds.
Thank you very much. And let me just conclude by saying fully supporting our safety net programs like Medicare, Medicaid, SNAP, and Social Security will reduce poverty, grow the middle class, and renew economic prosperity for all Americans. Unlike Republicans, Democrats simply do not believe that gutting the very programs that support poor and low-income families would reduce poverty. Programs such as the Child Tax Credit, the Earned Income Tax Credit. The Van Hollen Democratic Alternative Budget creates 1.2 million jobs this year. It reduces the deficit by 2.4% and makes huge key investments in our future.
Time of the gentlelady has expired. The gentleman from Wisconsin.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, let me yield myself a minute. Look, I very much appreciate the gentlelady from California, where she comes from on this issue. I believe her heart's in the right place. We, too, want to make sure that we get rid of poverty. We, too, want to make sure that people get on with their life, get that ladder of life so they can get out of poverty onto good lives. That's our aim here. Now, here's what we see. We have spent trillions of dollars on this war on poverty. We're spending $1 trillion a year at all levels of government to fight poverty. And what have we gotten for this? We have 46 million people in poverty. Poverty rates in America are at a generational high. So rather than measure our poverty-fighting efforts by how much money we throw at programs, by inputs, why don't we start thinking about measuring it by outputs, by people, how many people we're helping get out of poverty? By any measurement, this isn't working. I yield myself another minute to say that we need to rethink our premise here. Are we simply perpetuating poverty by treating its symptoms? Or shouldn't we look at what has worked in the past, what communities are doing to make a difference, and get behind those ideas? Let's fight poverty by attacking the root causes of poverty, to break the cycle of poverty, to get people out of poverty. Those are the ideas that we're talking about here. This is not a numbers thing. This is not a budget-cutting exercise. This is taking those ideas that were so successful in reducing child poverty and the welfare reform and applying them to the other programs that have not been reformed. Giving states more flexibility, having work requirements and job training requirements and block grants and time limits. What did that do? All the predictions of doom and gloom were there, but we lowered child poverty. We helped get single moms back to job training programs to get back to work. This is why we reform job training programs. This is why we call for reforming our safety net, because our goal, like her goal, is to get people on with their lives to reach their potential.
The gentleman has expired.
And with that, I'd like to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Stewart.
The gentleman from Utah is recognized for 3 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I am honored, yea, I am thrilled to stand and speak on this subject. It is the primary reason that I ran for Congress. And I think it is the defining issue and the most critical argument of our day. We are at a crossroads in our history. I believe that this time is that important. What we do at this moment will determine the future of our nation. It will determine the future of our children. It will determine the future or the death of the American dream. Stephen Covey, one of the great innovators and business leaders of our generation, and a man who happens to be from my home state of Utah, popularized a time management concept called the urgent important matrix. And the point of this was to help us focus on those things that are both urgent and important, and to let the other things go. And frankly, as a Congress, we do a terrible job at that. We often legislate based on the crisis of the moment, lurching from one man-made crisis to another. And the budget is a great example of that. For years, we have treated this as if it is neither urgent nor important, as if it could go on forever. But we know that that's not true. But we also know now what this president believes. He doesn't think it's important to balance our books. He doesn't think it's important to cut our debt. He has no intention of cutting any spending. And not only does he not intend to balance our budget, but he derides and dismisses those of us who think that it's important to our future. But Americans understand this, and it's not that hard. And please listen to me on this, because this is so important. A nation that is bankrupt cannot provide for the security of its citizens. A nation that is bankrupt cannot provide for the poor and the needy among them. And I speak now primarily to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. If you care about the poor, and I know that you do, and by the way, I do as well, then care enough to help them in the long run, not just for the next few years. There's nothing compassionate about letting Medicaid or Medicare go into bankruptcy. There's nothing compassionate about letting Social Security fail. But that's what's going to happen if we don't have the courage to fix this thing. And we have to fix it now. This is both important and urgent. Many of us had hoped that the President would lead on this matter, but he has chosen not to. It's not in his nature. He's much more comfortable leading from behind. But since he won't lead, those of us in Congress will. I admire Chairman Ryan. I thank him for his courage in tackling a challenge that has terrified Congress for years, reforming entitlements in a way to save them for our children. We have a window where we can make a difference. We can save America. We can save the American dream. Please, let us have the courage to do that. And that is why I support Chairman Ryan's budget and urge my colleagues to do as well. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back my time.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The President has been crystal clear. His top priority is to grow the economy, to put more Americans back to work, to strengthen the middle class, to have rising middle-class wages and upward mobility in this country. Because by attacking the jobs deficit, we can also bring down the budget deficit, because we know from the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office that more than half of our deficit this year is due to the fact that you still have a lot of people out of work who are looking for work, which is why it's so counterproductive to adopt the approach that our Republican colleagues do by not replacing the sequester. The Congressional Budget Office tells us we will lose hundreds of thousands of jobs just by the end of this calendar year. And those jobs are the most important thing to be available to help strengthen the middle class and lift people out of poverty. But to lift people out of poverty, it's also important to provide a little bit of support that they can stand on as they climb that ladder of opportunity. And unfortunately, this budget cuts into a lot of those legs on that stool of support, and nobody understands this issue better than our colleague, Ms. Lee. So I'm going to yield 30 seconds to Ms. Lee to respond on that issue.
Gentlelady is recognized for 30 seconds.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First, let me just say I appreciate the Chairman, Mr. Ryan, saying that he knows that my heart is in the right place, but I also want him to know that the facts speak for themselves. We have this chart right here, and it just demonstrates very clearly that 18 million people more, okay, would be living in poverty had it not been for those initiatives in this budget that you completely cut out. SNAP, the refundable tax credits, and the broad selection of other programs. 18 million more people would be in poverty. Also, let me just say that budgets are moral documents. They reflect values of who we are as Americans. And why in the world, as an American,
I yield the gentlelady another 15 seconds.
Gentlelady is recognized for 15 seconds.
Thank you. Why would we want to impose 66% of the cuts in your budget on low-income individuals and the poor? That does not make any sense. That is just morally wrong. Finally, I just have to say that the ranks of the poor began to grow under the Bush administration. In 2005...
I yield the gentlelady another 15 seconds.
Gentlelady is recognized for 15 seconds.
In 2005, I formed the Out of Poverty Caucus because I saw the Bush economic policies and what, in fact, they were beginning to do. We had probably 42, 43 members who joined that caucus. And so I just have to say to you, Mr. Chairman, that this didn't just begin. The ranks of the poor began to grow as a direct result of the economic policies that this budget wants to return to. Thank you again for your
time. The gentlelady has expired. The gentleman from Wisconsin.
Mr. Chairman, federal spending rises each and every year by 3.4% under this budget instead of 5%. And with that, I'd like to yield 3 minutes to a member of the Budget Committee, the gentlelady, Ms. Hartzler.
The gentlelady from Missouri is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your efforts to lead us to a path to prosperity. You know, when I am home in Missouri in the 4th District, I hear people say things like, I have to balance my budget. How come Washington doesn't? And it's time for our government to live within its means. And they might say, at home we're having to tighten our belts. Washington should too. Well, I have good news. I agree, and this budget reflects those concerns and those priorities. As a member of the Budget Committee, I'm proud to support a responsible budget that promotes economic growth while reducing wasteful spending. Currently, the federal government borrows 36 cents out of every dollar that it spends, and that puts us at astonishing over $16 trillion in debt. This creates anxiety, uncertainty at a time when unemployment is at 8% and a lot of families are hurting. We must end the government's reckless borrow, tax, and spend policies. Our budget balances in 10 years, and we do it without ever increasing taxes. Senate Democrats released a budget that actually increases taxes by $1 trillion and never, ever balances. This is worse than the status quo. Washington must stop spending money it doesn't have. We must target the real problem in this country faces, and that's uncontrollable spending. Instead of continuously taxing hardworking Americans more, we must pursue meaningful reforms and pro-growth initiatives. Our budget does that. The keys to this budget are growth initiatives which create jobs and proactive steps to preserve and protect Medicare and Medicaid for the future. Colleagues across the aisle like to claim that this is a voucher system, when this is false. The path to prosperity reforms Medicare for future beneficiaries by offering them the same kind of health care as other current federal workers and members of Congress. Future seniors are provided guaranteed issue health coverage where no one will be denied coverage based on health status or pre-existing conditions. They will be able to choose from a wide range of options, one of which will include traditional Medicare if they choose to do that. The government will pay all or part of their premium. Our updated Medicare plan would also give substantial help to the poor, who would qualify for greater relief, greater premiums than the wealthy. This will save the program from bankruptcy while fulfilling our commitment to health care security for seniors. The Democrat plan is to kick the can down the road and jeopardize this important program for our seniors. Our plan is right for senior citizens, and it's right for our future. Additionally, we take steps to preserve Medicaid, and we send it back to the states in the form of a block grant to allow local control and state control over this very important program and provide flexibility to help low-income individuals rather than forcing states to fit into one-size-fits-all program. It's important that we get people back to work, and our budget does that as well by consolidating and enhancing job training programs.
For additional 30 seconds.
All right, and pro-growth. But one of the best parts is that it gets our priorities right, and it provides for the common defense. There's only a few things we should be doing here, but it provides that. It replaces and repeals the President's sequester and makes sure that our men and women in uniform have what they need. So I encourage my colleagues to support this bill that gets our economy growing, has our priorities right, protects and preserves those programs for our seniors, and provides for the common defense. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Time of the gentlelady has expired. The gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let's be very clear. If you give states 1/3 of the amount of money they're currently getting from Medicaid and ask them to do the same job, which is what this budget would do just 10 years from now and increasingly down that path, you will, as the nonpartisan independent Congressional Budget Office said, quote, reduce access to care. That's the bottom line. With respect to the voucher program, premium support, again, I don't really care what label you attach to it. The impact is the same. If you want to achieve the out-year budget savings that our colleagues claim to achieve, you've got to put a cap on that amount, which is what their plan would do and which makes it entirely different than the plan we have for members of Congress and federal employees and the plan that most people in the private sector have as well. As this red line shows, the amount of support you would get would drop dramatically relative to rising health care costs, and that's why we don't call it premium support, because it doesn't provide support. I now yield a minute and a half to the gentlelady from Texas, a member of the Judiciary Committee, Ms. Jackson Lee.
The gentlelady from Texas is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for his leadership, and I certainly thank the Budget Committee for the work that they have done. And I'd make the argument that clearly we have a dilemma in focus and commitment and direction. I call the other budget the budget that has a sense of lacking of what people truly need. The Democratic budget is a budget that speaks to what people need and it cares about people. It also cares about family economic security. In the budget that Mr. Ryan is offering, the Republican budget, 3 million Texas seniors will see Medicare end as they know it. 50 billion seniors across 50 million seniors across America. But frankly, this is the real key on how the GOP budget really works. $500 billion in their so-called balancing is taken from the Affordable Care Act and the fiscal cliff deal. That's how they say they reach budget. So that means that they will undermine millions of Americans who will not have health care. That's the budget that does not concern itself with family economic security. Then if we want to look again at the idea of safety net programs, rather than giving Americans an opportunity to stand on their own feet, the Republican budget literally cuts the programs that help reduce poverty. So it is not one that cares about economic security for our families. Then, Mr. Chairman, if you want to really see what works, it really works when we talk to the top 2%. May I have 30 seconds?
I yield the gentlelady 30 seconds.
Gentlelady is recognized for 30 seconds.
When you look at the tax rate under President Clinton, that was 39.6%, and we created 20.8 million jobs. The Republican budget is a jobs killer. Then you have where we had a 35% tax rate, and you lost 580,000 jobs under George Bush. Here's the Democratic budget, the Van Hollen budget. We focus on creating jobs. We replaced the sequester, 750,000 jobs, reduced the jobs deficit by 450,000, and our total net is 2.1 million net jobs. Family economic security is the Van Hollen budget. I ask my colleagues to vote for the Democratic budget.
The gentleman from Wisconsin.
Thank you.
I'd like to yield a minute to the distinguished Majority Leader, Mr. Cantor.
Gentleman from Virginia, the distinguished Majority Leader, is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Chairman, I thank you, and I thank the gentleman from Wisconsin for his continued leadership on the issue of the fiscal outlook for our country, on the issue of the moral obligation that we have to our children and next, to address the growing mountain of debt that unfortunately they're facing. And, Mr. Chairman, I would say that, you know, this debate that we're having is a debate of contrast. You know, you look at the two budgets here in this chamber, you look at the budget that is underway across the Capitol. Ours is a budget that balances. Just as people at home around their kitchen table at the end of the month have to do with their checkbook every month, we believe the same is true. We balance this budget within 10 years. The other side calls for more taxes. The other budget that is being discussed in the other body, in fact, creates $1 trillion of new taxes. And the question for the American people really is, which budget do you think grows the economy? Which budget do you think helps folks gain some certainty, helps folks get back to work, helps folks who are relying on some of the programs that this body knows because its budget office is telling us are going to go away unless we act? It is clear. The choice is clear, and the contrast couldn't be more clear. I'd like to respond, Mr. Chairman, to some of the suggestions by members on the other side of the aisle that somehow our budget doesn't address the needs of those who are most in need. In fact, the opposite is the truth. Our budget protects the social safety net programs. The other budget on the other side of the aisle does nothing to respond to the alarms that have been issued by our budget counters and CBO and others year in and year out. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, all are on life support if we don't act. Our budget and the chairman of our budget committee has been a champion to say, let's be responsible. Let's help those who are in need. Let's preserve the social safety net, the programs that make America who she is. It is our budget that helps those in need, Mr. Chairman, not the other side of the aisle. Let's look at the question of tax reform. The people of this country have spoken out on this issue. They want a fairer and simpler code. What Chairman Ryan has done in this budget is provided a prescription for doing just that. A broadening of the base, a lowering of the rates, and yes, Mr. Chairman, an insurance in our budget that we're going to get rid of the special interest loopholes that have put Washington in the business of choosing favorites. And I think all of our constituents know that is not what they elect us to do. They want to see an even playing field for all. They want everyone in this country to have a fair shot. You compare tax reform and the position that we take in our budget to that which the other side is proposing in this body and in the one across the Capitol, I think it's very clear. Higher taxes without the reforms necessary versus what we're trying to do, which is even the playing field, giving everybody a fair shot to go and earn success. The choice is very clear, Mr. Chairman, that our budget provides some certainty for the future for the moms and dads out there who are desperate to know that we're doing our job in Washington on their behalf, that we're going to address this fiscal situation so that they can get on about their lives, so that they can see their kids have a better education, so that they can access the health care that they have come to know, and for those who don't have the health care can actually have a system that will lower cost and provide real prospects for quality health care, not the kind of health care designed by this Affordable Care Act that we're going to see come into law or to come into effect. So again, I want to thank the Chairman of Ryan of the Budget Committee, gentleman from Wisconsin, for his dogged attention to this very, very alarming question of how we're going to grow our economy, and doing it in a way that is thoughtful, that is well put, and has the specifics to go and do the job. Mr. Chairman, that's something that we've not seen from the other side. We've certainly not seen that from the White House. Hadn't even presented the budget yet. And that is unacceptable. So again, I urge my colleagues to support the budget coming out of our Budget Committee under the leadership of Chairman Ryan, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back his time. The gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just say a word about the health care provided in the Affordable Care Act. That means that you can stay on your parents' policy until you're 26. So if you have a terrible accident, the family's not bankrupted. That means that if you've got pre-existing conditions, you're not denied coverage by the insurance companies. We keep hearing repeal all those benefits, and someday we'll get around to replacing them. We've heard that for 3 years. Nothing in this budget about replacing. Now, I think the Majority Leader asked the right question. Which budget grows the economy? And I would just like to read from what the Majority Leader said on the floor of this House last year about the sequester. Here's what Mr. Cantor said. Under the sequester, unemployment would soar from its current level up to 9%, setting back any progress the economy has made. Then he cites a study showing that 200,000 Virginians' jobs are on the line. Well, guess what? The Republican plan leaves in place the deep sequester cuts. And that's why by the end of this year we will see 750,000 fewer jobs, including a lot fewer jobs in Virginia, as Mr. Cantor acknowledged. Why in the world we would want to do that when we have people struggling to find work, I don't know, because in the Democratic budget we replace the sequester so that we save those jobs. In fact, we invest more in jobs going forward. Now, on the tax issue, look, here's a headline from the other day in the Washington Post. A nonpartisan group did a study, headline, GOP tax cuts would benefit very wealthy. And that's the bottom line. Tax breaks for the folks at the very top. All those loopholes we talked about closing, not one loophole closure to help reduce the deficit in a balanced way. So I would like now to yield a minute and a half to the gentleman from Tennessee who's been working on these issues and working for working families, Mr. Cohen.
The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Van Hollen. I appreciate the time. thing that disturbs me the most about this budget is its inability to understand what our priorities should be. The Republican budget keeps the defense budget at $550 billion. No question we need a Defense Department, but I don't think the other side understands what the real enemy is. The enemy to my constituents and to each of us is not lurking overseas, it's disease. And to each American who will suffer from or has family members suffering from Alzheimer's or AIDS or cancer or heart disease, diabetes, Parkinson's, post-polio or whatever, they want cures and treatments. And the National Institute of Health is cut in this budget by at least $1.6 billion. It's a $30 billion budget. The Defense Department's $550 billion. I submit to you, Mr. Speaker, our enemy is disease. And the Department of Defense for the human being and the human body is the National Institute of Health. And at some place, the two parties should be able to come together and agree that we need to fund research which create jobs and find cures and treatments. The other side talks about what this is going to do to children and grandchildren. I've heard people talk about their children and grandchildren and what their mothers would want. Their mothers want their children to live long lives and not to suffer from cancer and to get cures and to get treatments. And the cures and the treatments, if I can have 30 seconds additional.
The gentleman another 30 seconds.
The gentleman recognized for 30 seconds.
The cures and the treatments are going to benefit the next generation and the generation after that more than this generation. This is a place where spending dollars creates jobs, saves lives, and benefits future generations. And most research that's been done in this country that's to come up with cures and treatments have been funded by the government or at least helped by the government, and that continues to this day. People say we should be different than Cyprus and Greece and Spain and Portugal, and we are, because we funded those researches and we've come up with the cures and the treatments, and that's why this is the greatest country on the face of the earth. We need to see that the National Institutes of Health are funded at a greater level and not diminished. I yield back the balance of my time, and thanks, Mr. Van Hollen.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The chair would remind the committee that the gentleman from Wisconsin has 11 minutes remaining. The gentleman from Maryland has 7.5 minutes remaining. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin.
Chairman, I'll just note for the record that funding on discretionary levels like that are set by the Appropriations Committee, not the Budget Committee. So those levels will be set later by the Appropriations Committee. I'd like to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman, Mr. Perry, from Pennsylvania.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. I deeply care about my mother, who's on Social Security and Medicare, and my 2 little girls, who are counting on their daddy to make sure that those programs are available when the time comes. And, of course, for the constituents that are counting on me to make sure that those programs are available for them. So I commend the Chairman, Chairman Ryan, on his leadership in drafting a budget that responsibly addresses our national debt and ensures that my own children and all the residents of the 4th District in Pennsylvania are not burdened with Washington's spending problem any longer. This legislation balances our budget in 10 years. I mean, I know some folks are saying, why 10 years? And I say, why not ever in your budgets? Why not ever? It reduces spending and makes responsible reforms to mandatory spending programs. Now, for the past few weeks, I've heard from hundreds of constituents, including my very own mother, about how this budget will change Social Security for current beneficiaries. And I want to make clear, the Ryan budget does not do that. It does not cut Social Security. But I will remind everybody that the Social Security Disability Insurance Fund will be insolvent by 2016. 2016, that's 3 years from now. So if you're 21 years old, when you're 24, it's insolvent. If you're 45 years old, when you're 48, it's insolvent. Now, the Medicare Part A Trust Fund will be exhausted by 2024. This is not a long time away for young people or old people. Now, I had to remind my mom that if these programs were not reformed, there would be nothing left for her grandchildren. There'd be nothing left for her son, and very likely there'll be nothing left for her. This legislation makes those reforms responsible by allowing Medicare recipients the opportunity to choose options specific to their needs. And it repeals the President's plan to have a group of unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats to slash Medicare benefits for seniors, including my mom. It also repeals the President's health care law, which has placed an undue burden on our job creators and their families. Penn Waste, a company in the district I represent, has told me that Obamacare health care costs, the Affordable Health Care law, will cost their employees a minimum of $68 a week more right now. $68. That's a meal out with your family. That's an extra tank of gas in your car. This budget also ensures our servicemen and women are protected by providing $560 billion for defense spending in fiscal year 2014, an amount consistent with America's military goals and strategies. This budget is responsible. The Senate budget, the Democrat budget, each one starts at no less than $1 trillion in new spending. I urge everybody to support the Ryan budget. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Maryland.